My name is simply the Hunter. That's how they know me in the few circles that handle the missions I've worked on. I'm a U.S. war veteran, with lethal expertise in weaponry and hand-to-hand combat. After decades of facing both human and non-human threats, I've become a shadow, a ghost whose deeds are written in classified files. No one truly knows how many times I've crossed the threshold between life and death, nor the things I've had to do in the name of national security. Over the years, I've realized that war isn't always against other men. There's something else, something that few know about. During my years of service, I took part in missions that never made it into the history books. These were black ops, missions so secret that not even my direct superiors knew the details. In these situations, we didn't fight soldiers or foreign armies, but abominations that shouldn't exist in this world. Beings and entities that defy the laws of physics and reason. Despite my field experience, there were times when even I doubted my sanity. Monstrosities slithering between shadows, creatures that seemed taken from the worst human nightmares. I've seen things I can't erase from my mind. Each mission brought me closer to an abyss I never wanted to know. But as my comrades fell one by one, I kept going, driven by a mix of duty, fear, and an insatiable curiosity for the unknown. Now old and without a family to answer to, I feel the need to tell these secrets. My time in this world is coming to an end, and I don't want to take these horrors to the grave. I want someone, somewhere, to know the truth. Humanity continues to live in ignorance, unaware of the horrors lurking beyond the visible. However, the darkness is real, and those who have faced it rarely live to tell the tale. On October 30th, 1995, I was called for a mission that would change everything I thought I knew. That day, I faced something unparalleled, a creature that didn't belong in this world. It happened in Germany, during a covert operation to contain the remains of a failed project. The monster had escaped the scientists' control, and what I found there was terror in its purest form. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened, we need to go back a little further. My memories begin on a quiet night, alone in my cabin, where I was trying to enjoy the rare peace I knew. Silence enveloped me as I lit a cigar, letting my mind wander far from the atrocities I had witnessed. However, as always in my life, the calm didn't last long. The phone rang, breaking the silence. I knew that a call at that hour could never bring good news. I answered with a simple, yes, expecting the worst. The general was on the other end of the line. I could hear the tension in his voice, something rare for a man as ruthless as him. "We need you at the base immediately," he said gravely. I knew that when the general called like that, there was no room for unnecessary questions. I stubbed out my cigar in a nearby ashtray and stood up. "What's going on?" I asked, though deep down I already sensed that whatever it was, I wouldn't want to hear it. "There's a situation in a small town in Lower Saxony called Hueda. Unexplained deaths, bodies mutilated in ways that don't make sense. The situation is out of control, and we believe something inhuman is behind it." The general's words echoed darkly. This wasn't the first time I had received such a report, but the uneasy feeling creeping down my spine told me that this would be worse than anything I had faced before. Without wasting time, I hung up the phone and began packing the essentials. My karambit, a curved blade that had saved my life more times than I could count, was the first thing I put in my bag. Then, a Smith & Wesson revolver, though I knew that against some creatures, bullets were as useless as a whisper in a storm. My cabin was filled with memories and tools of war, but in my missions, simplicity was always my ally. Just as I finished packing, the hum of helicopter blades in the sky told me it was close. I stepped out into the cold night and saw it descending, its lights flickering in the darkness like a bad omen. A rope ladder dropped from the helicopter, and without hesitation, I grabbed it and climbed up. The wind roared around me, but my mind was already focused on the mission. There was no time for distractions or emotions. The flight to the base was silent, but not a comfortable silence. I could feel the urgency in the atmosphere, the weight of what awaited me in Germany. Upon arrival, the helicopter landed smoothly, and as it touched down, a colonel with a stern face and tired eyes greeted me. "Hunter, good to see you," he said, though there was no trace of joy in his voice. I knew what was coming. A dangerous mission with slim chances of success. Without wasting time, he led me to a discreet building on the base. There, in a small meeting room, he presented me with a classified file. "This is Project Shatan Blute," he said, sliding the document toward me. What I read left me cold. This wasn't just a simple hunt, but something much darker and more dangerous. As I skimmed through the pages, I knew that what awaited me in Hueda went beyond anything I had faced before. The helicopter took off again, leaving my cabin and the brief peace I had enjoyed behind. As we flew through the night sky, I replayed the general's words in my mind. It wasn't the first time I'd faced something inhuman, but each new case seemed to surpass the previous one in horror and complexity. My body was tense, and though darkness enveloped me, my thoughts were laser-focused on the mission. The landscape beneath us blurred as we flew over Europe. There was no time to dwell on details, but the thought of returning to Germany, a place heavy with war stories, brought back memories I'd rather forget. The closer we got to the base, the more I could feel the weight of the upcoming operation. I knew I wasn't prepared for what was coming. But in my line of work, you never are. Finally, the military base's lights appeared on the horizon. The helicopter began its descent, and as we touched down, a chill ran down my spine. A colonel with a hardened face and tired eyes awaited me on the tarmac. "Hunter," he said in a curt tone, "we have a lot to talk about." He led me to a secluded building where several officers moved silently, their faces grim. I knew we were in uncharted territory, and the atmosphere confirmed it. We headed to a small meeting room where a classified file awaited me on the table. The colonel gestured for me to sit and pushed the document toward me. "This is what we know," he said as he opened it. On the file's cover, a name immediately caught my attention: Project Shatan Blute. I knew the Germans had been experimenting with genetic technology for decades, but what I read in that file surpassed any conjecture. Project Shatan Blute had begun as an effort to create the perfect soldier, combining human genetics with animal traits. However, the results had been disastrous. What they created wasn't a soldier, but an abomination. The creature had escaped the Hueda facility, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. And now, that same creature was loose, hunting the innocent in the village. Every word in the file was more unsettling than the last. Descriptions of grotesque mutilations, bodies found with their insides torn open, their organs missing, and worse still, reports indicated that the monster had superhuman abilities, including rapid regeneration. I knew at that moment that I was facing something beyond human. As I closed the file, the colonel broke the silence. "Our informant in Hueda is tracking the creature, but he can't handle it alone," the colonel said, watching my reaction. "We believe it's the last surviving subject of Project Shatan Blute, the only one who survived the genetic modifications. It's faster, stronger, and most disturbingly, it can blend in with people. We don't know how many it's killed already, but the number of missing people keeps rising." His tone was serious, almost defeated, as if he knew that what we were up against might be beyond our control. I looked at the colonel and nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a normal hunt, and the enemy wasn't just a trained man. It was an aberration, something that shouldn't have existed. "I'm going to need more than my usual gear to face this thing," I said coldly. The colonel gestured toward the door, calling for an officer. "Prepare everything the hunter needs. This is an extreme case." I knew that what I requested weren't just simple weapons. Blessings from the church and other ancient methods of combat against dark creatures were becoming an essential part of my arsenal. I stood up from the chair and followed the colonel to a nearby hangar where a Hercules cargo plane awaited me. "This plane will take you as close to Hueda as possible," the colonel explained as we walked among soldiers and officers who seemed tense, their faces grim. "We can't risk a conventional insertion, so you'll do a parachute jump near the forest surrounding the village. The informant will be waiting for you to give you more details." His words were practical, but the weight of the mission was not lost on either of us. Before boarding the plane, I checked my gear one last time. My trusted karambit was secured in its sheath, while the Smith Wesson revolver rested firmly on my belt. Although those weapons wouldn't completely stop the creature, I knew we'd have to combine the physical with the spiritual to have any chance. I boarded the Hercules and mentally prepared for what was to come. I knew that once again, I was about to face something beyond human comprehension. The flight to Hueda passed in tense silence. The plane's engines roared in the darkness as I mentally reviewed every detail of the mission. This creature, this failed experiment, wasn't something that could be hunted easily. The nature of its existence defied everything we knew as possible. I knew the risk was greater than in any previous mission, but if anything had defined me over the years, it was my ability to face the impossible, no matter the odds. The file detailed the origins of Project Shatan blute precisely. It had begun in 1994, when Germany was in the midst of scientific expansion after reunification. The government, seeking to consolidate its power, collaborated with advanced research institutes on a secret project whose goal was simple but ambitious: to create a superior soldier through genetic modifications. In theory, it was a military science breakthrough, but the reality that followed was an indescribable horror. The scientists behind the project used cutting-edge genetic engineering technology, including CRISPR, a gene editing technique that allowed them to manipulate human DNA with relative ease. They selected genes from animals with outstanding characteristics, hoping to obtain superhuman abilities. Among those chosen were genes from bats, for their acute night vision and incredible sensory perception, and salamanders, known for their astonishing tissue regeneration abilities. The process was as dangerous as it was innovative. 3 human subjects, selected for their excellent physical condition, were administered a genetic modification serum. These subjects underwent a series of exhaustive treatments to ensure the modified genes integrated into their DNA. However, 2 of the 3 subjects couldn't withstand the genetic alterations. The report was graphic. Their bodies collapsed catastrophically during the process, their internal organs simply exploding under the pressure of the modifications. But the 3rd subject survived. And not only did he survive, but he transformed into something more. Analyses indicated that this individual had developed superhuman abilities, strength, speed, and agility far beyond any human limit. His regeneration ability was astounding, able to heal serious injuries in minutes, but these abilities came with terrible deformities. His skin turned pale like a corpse, his teeth sharpened into fangs capable of piercing metal, and his hands transformed into deadly claws. The scientists, proud of their creation, believed they could control the creature. They implemented a brain monitoring device to ensure its obedience. However, the evolution of its brain was so rapid that soon the subject escaped the control of the waves. What followed was carnage in the facility. The file detailed the atrocious deaths the creature caused when, in an uncontrollable rage, it slaughtered everyone present. The report spoke of bodies torn apart, limbs scattered across the floor, and screams silenced in seconds. The creature escaped the facility, and since then, it had been hiding in the shadows, moving stealthily, and attacking when least expected. The German government, terrified of the repercussions, covered up the entire incident, but the informant's reports revealed that the creature was adapting quickly. It was using its advanced intelligence to go unnoticed among the population. I knew my mission now was to eliminate it before it became even more dangerous, but just thinking about what I would face left a knot in my stomach. As I closed the file, the seriousness of the situation sank deep into my mind. We weren't dealing with a simple failed experiment. This creature had evolved, and now it possessed an almost human intelligence combined with superhuman physical abilities. I knew we'd need more than conventional weapons to stop it. The colonel interrupted my thoughts with a crucial piece of information. "We have an informant in Hueda," he said seriously. "He's a scientist who worked on the project and managed to escape before the massacre." This informant had been watching the creature since its escape, providing valuable information about its movements. According to his reports, the subject had become more unpredictable and was hunting humans in the village under the cover of darkness. The disappearances were already alarming, but the worst part was that local authorities, under the influence of the German government, had decided to cover up the whole affair. To the inhabitants of Hueda, the disappearances were an unsolved mystery, but the truth was far more terrifying. There was no time to waste. I knew that the longer it was free, the more people would die. "Where is the informant now?" I asked, my voice firm despite the nervousness coursing through me. The colonel replied, "He's hiding in the forest, keeping a close watch on the village. He'll meet you at a rendezvous point outside Hueda. He'll guide you to the last place where the test subject was seen. I nodded, knowing that this mission required surgical precision. The plan was simple in theory: a nighttime parachute jump near the forest, where I would meet the informant. From there, we would follow the creature's trail and eliminate the threat. But I knew that missions rarely went as planned. There were too many variables, too many risks. As I headed toward the Hercules plane that would take me to my destination, my mind replayed every possible scenario. I was prepared for the worst, but I knew that with these kinds of monsters, preparation only takes you so far. I boarded the plane with the familiarity of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The pilot greeted me with a brief nod as I adjusted my parachute gear. I knew that one misstep during the jump could mean the end of the mission before it even began. The informant would be waiting, but I didn't know how much longer we could maintain the element of surprise. The creature had already shown itself to be more cunning than we expected, and the possibility that it was watching us from the shadows wasn't out of the question. The plane took off, and as we ascended into the dark night sky, I focused on my breathing, mentally preparing for the jump and what would follow. Despite the tension, I felt a cold determination. This wouldn't be my first hunt, and though the enemy was different, it was still just another prey. At least that's what I kept telling myself to stay focused. I knew that, in the end, only one of us would leave Hueda alive, and I didn't plan on dying that night. The plane's door opened, and the roar of the wind filled the cabin. Below me, the dark landscape of Hueda stretched out like a haunting void. With one last check of my gear, I approached the edge and jumped into the abyss, leaving behind the safety of the plane and plunging silently into the unknown. As I descended, the world reduced to nothing but the sound of the wind and the pounding of my heart. At about 2,500 feet above the ground, I deployed the parachute. The violent tug slowed my fall abruptly, and the wind whistled as my descent slowed drastically. The forest clearing came into view. I prepared for landing, adjusting my body to cushion the impact. I touched down with relative ease, rolling on the damp grass before unhooking the parachute and hiding it among the trees. I was alone, surrounded by the stillness of the forest. For a few seconds, I remained motionless, letting my senses sharpen. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves under my boots. Hueda was near, but the informant had yet to make his presence known. Barely a few minutes had passed when a tall, slender figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. The man moved with studied caution, clearly accustomed to operating under stealth conditions. "Hunter," he said quietly as he reached my position. There was no need for formal introductions. We both knew why we were there. He was the scientist who had escaped Project Shatan blute before the creature massacred the research team. His face bore the marks of experience and fear. "Things are worse than we thought," he said as he came closer. "The creature has been hunting in the village for the past few weeks. 7 people have disappeared, and the government has managed to cover it up so far, but it's only a matter of time before they lose control." His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but not out of fear of me. Rather, it was the fear of what we both knew was out there, lurking in the shadows. "Do you have any leads on its current whereabouts?" I asked, making sure my karambit was within reach. "We know it moves at night. So far, it only attacks in the darkest hours, which gives us a small window of action during the day. But at night it becomes unstoppable," he explained. I knew that every second counted, and any misstep could be fatal. "We have to move fast. If it's hunting now, we need to find its trail before it disappears again." With that warning, the informant led me toward the village, where the real horrors awaited. I felt the weight of the hunt upon me. This would not be an easy enemy. We moved silently through the forest, following the path toward Hueda. The moon, barely visible through the clouds, cast a pale, cold light over the landscape. As we approached, I could feel the tension in the air. Every step toward the village was like walking into the mouth of a beast. I knew the creature was watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As we neared the village's perimeter, I saw the first faint lights of houses in the distance, flickering weakly in the darkness. We were about to enter enemy territory. The informant led me straight to Hueda's church, a stone building that stood like a silent guardian in the middle of the village. Despite its solemn appearance, the atmosphere around the church offered no comfort. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than normal, and the air was heavy with palpable tension. "We need to bless our weapons before night falls completely," the informant said as we approached the church's heavy doors. "The creature, whatever it is, fears ancient protections." I'm not a man of faith, but I knew that in situations like this, I couldn't leave any stone unturned. Although I had trusted my skills and weapons more than the supernatural, I had learned after so many hunts that in this kind of situation, any advantage was welcome. The priest greeted us with a serious look, almost as if he had been expecting our arrival. He was a thin man, frail in appearance, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he knew more than he'd let on. "The evil you face is great," said the priest, as he prepared a small container of holy water. "I have seen the fear in the villagers' eyes. They don't speak of it, but they know. Something dark has taken hold of Weda." His words resonated with an unsettling truth, and though I wasn't entirely convinced that prayers could stop the creature, I was willing to try. The priest began muttering prayers in Latin, dipping a small cross into the holy water before sprinkling it on our weapons. The atmosphere inside the church grew heavier as the ritual progressed. The informant, though visibly more devout than I, remained calm. We were preparing our souls, but more importantly, our weapons. As the priest continued with his prayers, I looked at my karambit, now covered in drops of holy water. It was a blade made for close combat, to cut with lethal precision. It wasn't the first time I had wielded a weapon in a deadly mission, but this time the fight would be against something that didn't belong to this world. "May God protect you," said the priest as he finished. I looked at the informant and nodded, ready for what was to come. We left the church, and the darkness outside immediately enveloped us. The stillness of the village felt suffocating. I knew something was watching us. As we moved through the empty streets, the informant showed me some of the places where the victims had been found. There were no obvious traces, but the sense of impending danger kept growing. The silence was interrupted by a blood-curdling scream that echoed throughout the village, a sound that chilled the blood, one that could only come from a victim in their final moments. I exchanged a look with the informant. The hunt had begun. We knew the monster was near. We headed toward the source of the scream, our weapons ready, prepared to face the horror hiding in the dark. We sprinted toward the origin of the scream, each step echoing with urgency in the village's empty streets. The sound led us to a narrow dead-end alley. Upon arrival, what I saw was a scene that encapsulated pure terror. In front of us, the test subject, the creature, was hunched over a woman. Its sharp claws were slicing open her stomach with terrifying precision. Despite the unbearable pain she must have been feeling, the woman was still alive, groaning weakly, too weak to scream. The creature lifted its head, and its eyes met mine. What I saw in that gaze froze me for a brief moment, not just hatred, but a kind of intelligent malice, as if it took pleasure in the destruction it was causing. Its pale, translucent skin glistened under the moonlight, and its blood-stained fangs gleamed unnaturally. I knew this confrontation wouldn't be like any other. The creature was fast, lethal, and worse still, it enjoyed the pain it inflicted. "Back!" I shouted to the informant, drawing my karambit and preparing for combat. The informant, though nervous, obeyed immediately, stepping back as I charged toward the beast with the speed trained over years of combat. The creature watched me approach, and with an inhuman roar, it lunged at me. I managed to land a direct kick to its face, sending it crashing against a trash container, giving me precious seconds to get to the woman. But it was too late. Her gaze was vacant, her body limp, and her soul had left this world. I felt a mix of fury and guilt, knowing I had arrived too late to save her. "I'm sorry," I muttered softly, as I turned my attention back to the creature, which was already rising, recovering from the blow. Its regeneration was so fast that the wounds I had inflicted were already beginning to heal. The beast stood before me, and its transformation began again. Its claws grew even longer, its jaw deformed, and its speed increased to terrifying levels. I knew this confrontation would be to the death. "Get back," I shouted to the informant, who was trembling in fear behind a nearby container. "This is going to get ugly." With a deafening roar, the creature launched itself at me with superhuman speed. But I was ready. The fight that followed was a frenetic dance of blood and steel. The creature was fierce, but I had trained my entire life for moments like this. Every movement of my karambit was precise, each cut calculated to cause maximum damage. However, for every wound I managed to inflict, the beast began to heal almost instantly. I knew I couldn't keep up this pace for long. My only option was to exhaust its regeneration before my own body gave out from the strain. The battle raged on, and I finally managed to sever one of its arms with a clean strike. The creature roared in pain, but what happened next left me cold. The beast's flesh began to writhe and regenerate, its arm growing back before my very eyes. The horror was indescribable. This wasn't just an enhanced creature, it was something else. I knew I'd have to end this quickly if I wanted to get out of there alive. The creature, wounded but regenerating rapidly, disappeared into the night's shadows, slipping away with inhuman speed down the alley. I stood there, panting and covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of the woman I hadn't been able to save. Rage and frustration consumed me, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Even though the monster had escaped, something didn't add up. There was more to this situation than I had initially perceived. The informant emerged from his hiding place, pale and trembling, unable to speak after witnessing the fight. "It's hurt, but not for long," I said through gritted teeth, my mind still processing what had just happened. The creature had demonstrated a regeneration ability that far exceeded what the reports had indicated. It was healing at an absurd rate, and its intelligence was undeniable. We weren't just dealing with a simple experiment gone wrong. This was a creature that understood the art of the hunt. The situation forced me to reconsider everything we had done up to that point. The creature had chosen Hueda as its refuge. But why? The village was small, seemingly insignificant. However, there was something about this place that seemed to attract it. I couldn't ignore the feeling that everything was connected somehow. My thoughts drifted to the church, the last place where we had felt safe for a moment. Something wasn't right about that building, about the priest's unsettling calm. "Let's go to the church," I said, making the decision to follow my instincts. The informant looked at me, surprised. "What? Why would we go back there?" he asked, his voice still shaky. "There's something else in this village, something we haven't seen. The priest. Something about him doesn't add up," I replied as I began walking toward the stone building. The informant followed me, though with clear reluctance. I knew we couldn't waste more time, but my instinct told me that I couldn't ignore what was right in front of my eyes. When we arrived at the church, I pushed the doors open with more force than necessary, feeling a growing urgency inside me. The priest was waiting on the other side of the altar, his expression serene, as if nothing had changed since our last visit. "What's wrong?" he asked with an unsettling calm. "The creature escaped, but it left a trail, one that leads directly here," I said, my gaze fixed on the priest as I searched for any sign of weakness in his eyes. "No evil can enter God's house," the priest responded firmly. His tone was calm, but there was something in his voice that put me on edge. The informant, unsure of what to do, remained silent behind me, but his eyes reflected the same distrust I felt. "I'm going to search the place," I stated, my hand already on the hilt of my karambit. The priest nodded, but I noticed a slight tremor in his hands. As I headed toward the back of the church, I knew that something dark was about to reveal itself. I walked down the central aisle of the church with firm steps, my senses alert to any sign of danger. The informant followed closely behind me, his eyes scanning every corner with a mix of fear and distrust. We reached a door at the back of the altar, a small entrance that seemed insignificant, but from which emanated a faint smell of blood and death. "Here," I whispered, more to myself than to the informant. When I opened it, what I saw left me frozen. Behind that door was a small room filled with jars grotesquely piled up, each one filled with human brains and blood. The stench was unbearable, and the horror emanating from that small room was palpable. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was a death shrine, a dark altar where something more sinister was taking place. "My God!" exclaimed the informant, recoiling in horror at the macabre scene. I knew there was no time for hesitation. We were in the midst of something much bigger. I turned abruptly at the sound behind us. The priest was closing the main door of the church, his expression slowly transforming into something much more sinister. All of this is your doing, I said, my voice filled with fury and disgust. The priest smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was the twisted grin of someone who no longer belonged to this world. It would have been easier if you had left, but now that you know too much, I have no choice, he said, his voice, once calm, now dripping with menace. I pulled out my revolver and aimed, but when I pulled the trigger, the shot didn't go off. That was your doing too, wasn't it? I asked as my mind processed the possibility that he had tampered with my gear. The priest laughed softly, a chilling laugh that cut through me. I wanted to make this more interesting, he replied as he began to transform before my eyes. His body twisted unnaturally, his bones cracked, and his skin stretched as he transformed into something monstrous, far more terrifying than the vampire I had faced earlier. I knew I'd have to use my karambit to face what was coming. I unsheathed both blades and prepared for battle. The priest, now fully transformed into a beast with sharp fangs and lethal claws, lunged at me with superhuman speed. The fight was brutal from the very first moment. Every blow I landed with my blades was countered by the ferocious attacks of the monster. The sound of metal clashing with claws echoed inside the church, now turned into a battlefield. Despite the monster's ferocity, my years of hand-to-hand combat experience gave me a slight advantage. I dodged its attacks, delivered kicks and quick strikes with my karambits, each cut aiming to tear through its monstrous skin. However, in a moment of distraction, one of my karambits fell to the ground, sliding out of reach. The monster seized the opportunity, slashing my side with its claws. The pain was sharp, but I didn't stop. I knew I couldn't afford to falter at that moment. The wound on my side burned like fire, but the pain only fueled my determination. With the last karambit in hand, I turned toward the monstrous priest, who now stood over me, licking his fangs in a gesture of anticipated satisfaction. I knew I was wounded, but I also knew I couldn't win unless I exploited his arrogance. In a quick motion, I crouched down and grabbed a nearby piece of wood, the result of the battle, and drove it with all my strength into the creature's heart. The monster howled, its scream echoing throughout the church as it writhed in pain. However, it wasn't defeated yet. The piece of wood hadn't been enough to kill it. I seized the moment while it staggered and, with one last effort, launched a series of rapid strikes with the karambit, slashing its throat with a clean cut. The creature dropped to its knees, dark blood flowing from the wound, and in a final move, I severed its head. Its body collapsed to the ground, motionless. I stood there panting, watching as the head rolled away from the body. The silence that followed was deafening. The church, which had been the scene of a fierce fight, was now wrapped in a deadly calm. The informant, who had remained hidden during the battle, emerged from the shadows with an expression of absolute horror. Is it dead?" he asked in a trembling voice, staring at the remains of the priest. I nodded slowly, never taking my eyes off the corpse. Despite the victory, I felt that something was still wrong. The priest had only been part of the problem. The original creature, the beast from Project Shatan Blute, was still on the loose. I knew this wasn't over, that the real enemy was still lurking in the shadows of Hueda. However, I needed time to recover and plan my next move. "The mission isn't over yet," I told the informant as I cleaned the blood off my karambit. "The original creature is still out there." I reported to my superiors via walkie-talkie that the church had been purged, but the main target was still active. A cleanup team would arrive soon to take care of the body and the area. While I waited for the team's arrival, I sat on the church steps, feeling the weight of accumulated fatigue. My body was wounded, but the physical pain was the least of my concerns compared to the pressure of what was still to come. I knew I had won a battle, but the war against that creature was far from over. I lit a cigar, a ritual that had accompanied me through many similar moments, and let the smoke fill my lungs. I needed a brief moment of calm before the next storm arrived. The sound of helicopter blades broke the silence, signaling the cleanup team's arrival. The helicopter descended gently in the village center, and out stepped one of the high-ranking officials who had coordinated the mission. He approached me with a look of gratitude and weariness. "Thank you for your service, Hunter," he said as he extended a hand. "We couldn't have contained this without your help." I shook his hand, but my thoughts were already elsewhere. The real target was still alive, and every second that passed gave that beast more time to recover. "This isn't over," I replied coldly. "The creature that caused all this is still loose. If we don't stop it, Hueda will only be the beginning." The official nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll do everything we can to locate it," he promised. But we both knew the task wouldn't be easy. This monster had learned to move in the shadows, to hunt without being seen. Its intelligence and regeneration made it an almost impossible prey to track. After giving one last look at the village, the informant and I were escorted to the helicopter. As we flew away from the horror scene, the dawn began to light up the horizon. We had survived the night, but the danger still loomed. The informant, who had been a nervous figure throughout the mission, now seemed calmer, though his face bore psychological scars that would take time to heal. "Thank you for saving me," he said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You survived, that's what matters," I replied, without ceremony. Although the informant had done what he could, we both knew that the fight to come would be much harder. "Rest while you can. This is just the beginning," I added, as the helicopter carried us away from Hueda, back to the military base. I knew we wouldn't have much time before the creature attacked again. The hunt had begun, and I was ready to follow its trail to the end. As the helicopter flew over the fields and forests of Germany, I couldn't help but think back to the creature that was still loose. Project Shatan blute had given birth to a monster, but who could say there weren't more hidden experiments, more atrocities waiting to be uncovered? The thought that the German government might be covering up more horrors filled me with unease. This creature, this modern vampire, was only the first step of something bigger. I knew that sooner or later they would call me again. It was inevitable. The horrors of the world didn't rest, and there was always someone willing to create monsters in the name of power and science. My mission was simple: find them and eliminate them before they could do more harm. But with each confrontation, I left a part of myself behind. With every monster I hunted, I grew more numb, colder. I was no longer the man I once was, but that didn't matter anymore. The only reason I was still alive was because I knew the rules of the game. The informant, sitting beside me in the helicopter, looked at me with a mixture of respect and fear. He knew that, although he had been helpful, he wasn't prepared for what was coming. "What do you think the creature will do now?" he asked, breaking the silence. I thought for a moment before answering. "It'll seek shelter, lick its wounds, and wait for its chance. These things don't act without thought. It's patient, smarter than you think, but we'll find it. It can't hide forever." I knew the next confrontation would be even more brutal. The creature would learn from its mistakes, and we would have to adapt. But I also knew that I would hunt it to the ends of the earth if necessary. There was something inside me that couldn't rest as long as those horrors walked the earth. "This is only the beginning," I muttered to myself, remembering the words I had spoken before the battle in Hueda. That feeling that the worst was yet to come was undeniable. The helicopter began its descent over the military base, marking the end of this phase of the mission. But as the gears of the war machine moved around us, I was already thinking about the next step. Soon, we'd be back on the ground, tracking the creature, hunting what was left of that failed project. Meanwhile, I had one last breath before the hunt began again. I pulled another cigar from my pocket and lit it, letting the smoke fill my lungs once more. I watched the sun rise on the horizon. A new day was beginning, but for me, each day was just an endless extension of the night. I knew the darkness always returned, and I, the hunter, would be waiting in the shadows, ready to face whatever came next. Because in this world, where horrors lurked around every corner, someone had to be the line that kept them at bay. Until the next hunt, I muttered to myself, as the helicopter touched down, and I prepared for the next mission fate would throw my way.